Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Frank Clifford of the London School of Astrology. This is a series of interviews with expert astrologers to discover how they approach client work and how they actually prioritize, synthesize, and interpret birth charts. We'll also discover how they go about communicating that information to their clients. Each session will introduce the astrologer's approach, and then we'll be looking at a chart or two with them to see this approach in practice. Each master astrologer is giving their time for an important cause, and the London School of Astrology is donating £150 per session to the charity selected by the astrologer. So our guest today, Greg Bogart, has chosen UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. So let me introduce you to Greg. Greg Bogart is an astrologer, a psychotherapist, and a lecturer in psychology at Sonoma State University, where he teaches courses on depth-oriented psychotherapies and myth, dream, and symbol, and other subjects too. His work combines meditation, yoga, and dream work with the cyclical wisdom and archetypal symbolism of astrology. His books include Planets in Therapy, Astrology and Spiritual Awakening, Astrology and Meditation, and his websites are gregbogart.net and dawnmountain.com. So hopefully that's all correct. Greg, welcome, Greg. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Frank. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. My first question really is as a psychotherapist and an astrologer, what percentage of your time is divided between psychotherapy and astrology?
Right now, since COVID has closed my in-person offices and I'm working by telephone, I'm doing about 1.5 days of psychotherapy and then astrological sessions several days of the week. And then I teach one college course, Psychology of Yoga. So that's how my time is allocated. The charts I might do 1 or 2 in a day, 2 or 3 days a week.
And where do you get time for the writing?
I do it all the time. I do it at night. I get up early in the morning before anybody is awake, and I write then. I write on the back of envelopes and napkins while standing, doing a dog walk. I write really whenever the thought occurs to me.
Right. Okay. And so you've been an astrologer obviously a number of years. Would you look back and think there was one astrologer that influenced you most, or did you have any mentors?
Yes, I had several mentors. You know, the first man who taught me astrology was a homeless man in Eugene, Oregon, named John Damian Kennedy, who had the Sabian symbols memorized. And he was the one who turned me on to Rujar's Astrological Mandala, which is just a remarkable book. I had a teacher of esoteric astrology named Pat Stauffer back in Boulder, Colorado. We read the Alice Bailey material. I learned this in 1982. But prior to that, I had worked for 9 months with this Venezuelan astrologer named Andres Tacra. And I've written about him in all my astrological books because he was a real character, but I apprenticed with him and ghost wrote a book on sidereal astrology that he dictated to me. And this was my apprenticeship with an astrologer. And even though I did not remain a siderealist, I learned a tremendous amount from him about the art of counseling people. Then Rujar became a strong influence. And while I only met him twice, we corresponded over several years. So he and his writings, obviously, were a tremendous influence. An astrologer in Madison, Wisconsin, named Shelley Jordan, taught me a great deal of technique. We've studied since 1983. We've studied astrology together. So we learned cosmobiology. She taught me about midpoint trees. And so that was significant. And then beyond that, the astrology is the teacher.
Indeed, and the clients, of course, and the students. Yes. If you could sum up, what do you think astrology can do for people? What would you say, really?
To give orientation, to give meaning to what is happening. So just this morning, I'm talking to someone with a big career in finance, but a little bit oppressed by hard work, with Saturn and Pluto and Jupiter transiting her midheaven at 26 Capricorn. And so feeling the weight of work, but to see that the work is meaningful, has salience for her, gives her the ability to do this hard work and not feel like it's a burden, to feel like this is what she wants to do. So Saturn affirms the structures we have in place that we are working hard to sustain. That's one of the values of astrology. So it helps us understand ourselves as beings in the process of change and cooperating with the change that wants to happen. And this brings a sense of humor to daily life and an ability to roll with things, as well as to form clear intentions, to see possibilities forming, studying the ephemeris always for understanding the shape of the sky as it changes month by month and year by year. So we see our lives as having an orderly unfolding schedule. These are a few things.
Right.
And I've recently completed a book, which is being published as we speak, called Astrology's Higher Octaves, where I look at 6 things that I think astrology does. It provides a basis for emotional healing of difficult developmental challenges of the past. So it's a therapeutic aid. And I can say a lot more about that, but I use it psychotherapeutically, and anyone can use it for self-awareness and greater understanding of challenges, present and past, in development and upcoming challenges. So it brings a developmental understanding. It is useful in guiding careers. It is very helpful for us in understanding timing and different phases of careers, the forming of careers, the sustaining of careers, the altering, restructuring, or deconstruction of career paths. It is a brilliant aid in understanding our human relationships. There's no better tool for understanding the people we live with and love, and how they are organized. As we understand ourselves and we understand they're made in their own way, they're shaped in their own way, so we can accept them and tolerate them. And also, astrology is something that awakens us in daily life, so that the most mundane activities are part of the order of nature, part of what needs to be dealt with and addressed. And so forth. I think I'm giving a long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you. No, that's very insightful. And when clients, before they come to see you, do they get an idea of that? Do you tell them what to expect? Do you invite them to participate beforehand as well? How does that work?
I invite people, if they want to write out any of their concerns ahead of time, specific questions, but I don't do a lot to prompt them ahead of time. It depends. It's different with different people. Sometimes I'll tell someone to write down any dreams they have between now and the time of our session. Sometimes I don't say anything at all. It's not a single thing I do to prepare them. Many clients don't have any prior background in astrology. They don't know what it's about. And in those cases, I take the first 10 minutes and explain the symbols, the language, so the chart reading is understandable. I think that's important so people can gain understanding of, that we're not just talking out of thin air.
I think that's interesting because depending on the school of thought, some people say not to ever mention any astrospeak, and like you, I'm the first to want to show them what they're looking at and not overload them. But I think people like to go away thinking that they have the moon somewhere that they've never heard of before, or the ascendant. Is that really what you're doing?
Yes, we're giving them a map. We're giving them a map and giving them the beginning of an understanding of their own map. Now, if they're people who have already inquired into astrology, who are not complete newcomers to it, then it's even better because you're advancing their understanding of their map and how to read it for themselves. And that's what I think we're trying to do, is give people an organization of time, a sense of where they're going and where they stand right now, and the perfection of that. And also to see that the basis for change is in their hands, in our hands.
And how do you yourself prepare for a session? Do you do much work on it?
Yes, what I do is I print the natal chart. I print the natal chart with current transits, or I just look them up. But since I'm going to give this to the client, I calculate a bi-wheel with the natal and transiting planets. I do a second bi-wheel with the natal chart and the secondary progressions, and a third bi-wheel with the solar arc directions. And that's all I use. For my own chart or for clients that I work with for years, I will use midpoints. So, and I'll talk about how I use midpoints. That's another topic. But those are the charts that I study, and those are the charts that I refer to in the session. I no longer use any solar or lunar returns. I find I get much more precise understanding from transits, looking at the minutia of transits, not only the outer planet transits, but the inner planet transits over a span of 1 or 2 years, in a session. And the progress chart. That's really, if you can't read the indicators from those things, then you're not going deep enough. And I studied solar returns for decades, but came to the conclusion that one chart does not describe the year. So I use these other methods. That's what works for me. And those are the charts that I refer to with the client, and getting into anything beyond that is overload for most people. So even if all we do is talk through the transits, that's sufficient for an initial session. And often it will only be 1 or 2 progressed aspects that you delve into, but they may be meaningful ones.
And what I find is that you end up grouping progressions or directions with transits, and they're in some ways saying the same theme, even if they're different planets linked to different houses. Do you find that too?
Yes, you see repetition of themes, Mars, Saturn aspects in both transits and progressions, Sun, Jupiter aspects. Something resonates. So in other words, you can see the truth from many angles. The universe is holographic. You can look at it from all these different angles, and you'll see through the right lens. You'll see yourself if you reflect deeply.
And do you use any other points apart from the main planets? Any dwarf planets? Any extra bits?
No, in fact, I'm quite simple. I use the main lights and the other 8 planets, and I like to look at Chiron. Sometimes I use asteroids, but not always, and it just depends. With women's charts, I'm more likely to put all the asteroids, the major asteroids in. But no, I'm a little slow to learn about the new dwarf planets. I don't use Black Lilith. I don't use Uranian planets. I just think that I can feel the energy of my life just fine with those 10 planets and how they're transiting around and how they've progressed into different angles. That seems enough for me. I also do use minor progressions and methods like that, but that's a side show. That's something Tem and I were into, is the minor progressions.
And sort of like subheadings rather than the main headlines.
Right. No, minor progressions are fabulous. one lunar return after birth equals a year.
Mm.
But secondary progressions, solar arcs, those are super reliable. And with the solar arcs, I use the Reinhold Ebertin Noel Till method, which is I look at the solar arc planets. Obviously, they're major contacts to angles and other natal planets, but also contacts to midpoints. That's what I follow from my own chart. I have a 90-degree midpoint sort, and I track the solar arc planets to my midpoints. And I also use planetary stations. So when transiting planets, such as Saturn or Jupiter or Pluto, turn retrograde or direct, I study those degrees on a midpoint sort to understand what's happening. And that's amazing. So that's what has supplanted the solar and lunar returns for me. On the midpoint wheel.
So you mentioned some of your mentors a bit earlier on. Is there any advice or anything you remember being told that you've received from one of the mentors, or maybe
well,
a
a
colleague?
story that I've told in writing, but I'll tell it again, is my first lesson from my astrology teacher, Mr. Thakra, is so meaningful to me because he said, "Why do you want to be an astrologer?" And I said, "To help people." And he said, "That's right. That's the reason to be an astrologer." But the reason that lesson was so important is many people, I've met people who have different motivations, like they want to be far out psychics and blow people away. They think it's glamorous and exotic or whatever. But the main motivation for me is to help people. And astrology has helped me help myself. And that seems very useful to share in this world where people are often doing very dysfunctional things to try to cope with difficult times. So astrology is like a balm for the soul, medicine. And so that was one important thing that he taught me.
And when you finally hang up your ephemeris in whatever number of years from now, is that?
Never.
Never. Okay. Never. Like a good actor who dies on the stage, you'll be clutching it. Is that how you want to be remembered, in the sense that you helped, and is there something that you ever think about how you'd like to be remembered?
It's not something I think about a lot. I just hope the writing excites people.
Speaking of which of the books that I've mentioned, or maybe the new book coming out, is the best introduction for those just starting to get reacquainted with your work, or acquainted with it?
Let me pull a few things here. I'll show
Okay.
it. And I think the first book that I wrote, and I'm going to show you the original, this is the self-published book.
Yeah.
And this went through 3 printings of 1,500 copies. So an impressive 4,500 copies sold. And it was recently republished by AFA.
Yes.
So this book is really about astrology as a spiritual practice, astrology as a yoga, as a series of yogas and practices. So it's very spiritual and mystical kind of writing, and uses a lot of biographical examples of famous artists, musicians, mystics, and exciting figures. This book, Planets in Therapy, is more psychological. This was originally called Therapeutic Astrology, using the birth chart in psychotherapy and spiritual counseling. So this documents how I've been using astrology as a therapist to clarify themes that need exploration in therapy, to understand relational dynamics, to understand sources of emotional fixation, emotional pain. So it's a book that would be helpful for people who want to understand developmental issues pertaining to planetary cycles. And there's a fun chapter in here called Better Than Prozac, Astrology and Mental Health. where I say that astrology, in my opinion, is a superior antidepressant to pharmacological antidepressants. I believe there are a series of holistic methods that help. And so dream work, yoga, music and sonics, time in nature, and astrology are all a great program to be relieved from, depressed moods. So Planets in Therapy is really like 5 books in one, because it also has a treatise on Dame Rujar's astrology in plain language. So I try to translate his work into easy to understand terms. But there's a great astrologer, Philip Sedgwick, who once humorously introduced me, saying I had translated Rujar into English. But anyway, Rujar is fabulous, and his work should be read by every astrologer. But it helps to have a little introduction to his main concepts. So that's what I do. And I talk about, attachment issues, issues in cognitive development, the Venus-Mars cycle, the cycle of human attraction, and many other subjects. Then this book, since you've asked me to talk about this book presents the method of meditation in astrology. The idea that to understand anything in astrology, you need to contemplate with a quiet mind, to go deeply within into a state of stillness, receptivity to guidance, asking, what does this intend from this particular transit? What is Saturn asking of me? What does Jupiter want? What's the highest expression of this particular transit or progression? So this is the method I teach in all my books, but especially in that book. And so I think Astrology and Spiritual Awakening is a great introduction, but this work is being published in September and October of 2020, Astrology's Higher Octaves. So this is good for anyone who wants to learn about career guidance through astrology. And also a new methodology I've been developing on astrology and dreams, working with dream symbols alongside planetary symbols, and how working with them together is fantastically transformative and a lot of fun as well.
Right. Okay. I think it's fascinating how you combine so many of your interests into one book as well. I mean, that's we tend to have to compartmentalize at times, so it feels like you're bringing everything together for people.
Well, what I was trying to do is talk about different realms in my life where astrology affects me, influences me, and that's sort of the different ways that I try to share it with people.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. In the next session, we're going to have a look at some charts and to see what you do, how you do it. So thank you for the introduction, Greg. Thank you.
My pleasure, Greg.